What's up, you guys? It's Sarah at carnivore.yogi on Instagram. Thank you so much for coming back to my YouTube channel and clicking on today's video. Please hit subscribe while you're here. Don't forget to leave me a comment and share this video with anyone you feel could be helped. So I'm going to show you guys physically how I eat a high-fat carnivore diet. Now, I have talked about this in several other videos as to why I made this decision. My most popular video about why is the why I no longer eat 2 pounds of meat video. I'll make sure to link that below and put a little eye up there as well so you guys can access that. But essentially, after not really minding my macros on carnivore for a year, I started to experience low T3. My GFR numbers, which is your kidney filtration rate, was low, and my A1C was up. I also used a company called Let's Get Checked, who I will link below, to check and measure all those things. I have retested all of these things every 6 weeks or so since I went to a high-fat carnivore diet about 6 months ago. I have also used a continuous glucose monitor. I will link the one below that I have used. And that was the biggest thing for me, was looking at those numbers on the continuous glucose monitor in response to my food and seeing my numbers shoot up 30 and 40 points in my sleep. That's when I was eating a more high protein version of a carnivore diet. So I know that was a lot. And you guys are probably just tuning in to see how I prepare and eat my fat. So let's get right to it. Okay, so I'm gonna start off by showing you guys beef suet. Now, the source of your beef suet is important in my opinion. I have found a source, which I'm not going to share with you guys because every time I share my source, the place sells out. But I have found a source that I love, and you can eat beef suet raw, or I'm going to show you how you can render it down and eat it by the tablespoon. I actually find it to be a bit more satiating to render the suet down and eat it by the tablespoon. Now, what I'll typically do for a meal is put my meat portion on the plate and then measure out 2 or 3 tablespoons. Usually in the morning, it's just 2 tablespoons of the rendered suet. As I go throughout the day, I'll have maybe more like 3 tablespoons of that rendered suet with lunch or with dinner. You can also put that rendered down suet in your meat broth if you are avoiding dairy. So you can use butter on your high-fat carnivore diet. If you do, I recommend you use like a Kerrygold, or if you have access to a local farm, getting some raw butter from that local farm. I think that that can be extremely helpful. And just seeing how you feel. For me, when I eat too much butter, I know it's a histamine response. Now, I did a full video with Dr. Becky Campbell, which I will link below, all about histamines. If I eat too much butter, if my histamine bucket gets full, I will get a headache within 20 minutes of eating that butter. So my body is really good at letting me know, hey, we got to back off the butter for a little bit of time here. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you are going to switch to a high-fat carnivore diet and just try to use only butter, you may experience a histamine response or some sort of a reaction. So that's just something you want to be mindful of. You can use a continuous glucose monitor. Again, the one that I use is linked below to check in and also see if when you're eating a specific type of fat, if your blood glucose is going up, 20, 30 points, postprandial a couple hours after that meal. That's something to pay attention to make sure you're not having a reaction to that fat. So again, I do eat that beef suet kind of rendered down, and I keep that out on my countertop at room temperature, and that'll keep out for, it doesn't last very long in my house, to be honest with you. The longest I've kept it sitting out on the counter has been about 5 days, so I don't know if it will last longer than that 5 days. But that's typically how long I keep it out on my countertop. The other way you can eat beef suet is just raw, completely out of the fridge. You just cut that thing right off the block. I do recommend measuring out your how many ounces of that beef suet that you eat, because it is quite delicious. If you find a source that you enjoy, it can be very delicious, just almost kind of like butter. So I do recommend when you're eating a high-fat carnivore diet, you may want to consider in the very beginning at least to measure out to see how much of that fat you're eating, because it can be extremely easy to overeat. So with that raw beef suet out of the fridge, I typically don't keep a block of suet in my fridge longer than 1 week. I did accidentally keep a block of suet in my fridge for 2 weeks, and it went bad right at that 2-week mark. So you do want to be mindful, and I think the same thing actually goes for raw beef fat, which I'm going to talk about next. That you want to just be careful with how long you keep it in your refrigerator. Your best bet is always going to be keeping it in the freezer. So let's go ahead and talk about that frozen beef fat, the raw beef fat. I eat raw beef fat from the freezer. I do, again, you have to break it down. I buy mine from White Oak Pastures, and so you do have to break it down because there is quite a bit of meat left on that block of raw beef fat that you're getting, and that is going to influence how much protein you're eating. Now, if you eat a high-fat carnivore diet, you are going to have to moderate your protein. I don't go over 3 ounces of cooked protein per meal. Breakfast is usually around 2 ounces, lunch 3 ounces, dinner 3 ounces. That's pretty standard for me. The only thing I eat between meals would be some meat broth with butter in it if I'm tolerating butter at the time, or you can also put that rendered down beef suet into your meat broth, put some salt in there, and you're good to go. But typically, if I'm hungry in between meals, I will just measure out some beef suet, or I will have some of that rendered beef suet. Sometimes I also make raw beef fat snacks. So let's talk about the beef fat again. You can leave beef fat in a container after you've broken it down, either in your refrigerator for, I wouldn't really leave it in there for longer than a week. You've broken it down. And I find that the creamier, like the thicker, denser pieces of that raw beef fat just taste really good raw, and sometimes right out of the freezer. So super delicious. That's what I do. You can also, what a lot of people really enjoy doing is cooking that raw beef fat in a cast iron. Now, you definitely want to use a grease screen over that cast iron, because when you're cooking that amount of fat, you're going to have a big explosion of grease in your kitchen. So you can eat that raw beef fat on its own, or you can eat it with a meal. Now, when you're eating the beef fat, you do want to factor in a little bit of protein into your meal. So when you're, taking into account how much protein you're eating, and same thing with suet. The suet will have some meat left on it. You can see that when I render it down. There's a lot of meat left out that I strain and put into that container without the meat. So both of those, it's important to take into account that you're going to be getting some protein from the beef suet and also from the beef fat. The other fat that I use, I don't have visually any to show you guys because it's on order right now, is Iberico pork fat. So I take Iberico pork fat that I buy from White Oak Pastures. You can also just get regular pork belly as well. And I will slice it up, create bacon, and then there's usually a ton of fat left on that Iberico pork fat. So what you can do with that Iberico pork fat is you can actually just cut it off the block. And again, same thing like the raw beef fat, you can cut it up, keep in a container, measure it out so you know exactly how much you're eating. And I love to eat that raw Iberico pork fat straight out of the freezer. It is so delicious. Again, you will probably want to measure this out because it's very satiating. It's not very satiating. It is satiating, but it can be very easy to overeat because it tastes very good. Now, switching over to a high-fat carnivore diet from a standard carnivore diet, there is sometimes an adaptation period. There was for me. There was about 6 weeks where I took an HCl supplement, which I will link below, which helps to up your stomach acid. Even after being on carnivore diet for a solid year, I still didn't have enough stomach acid to manage all that fat. So I just took 1 capsule with dinner every night for 6 weeks. And then after that 6-week period, I came off the HCl and was fine. But I did have some loose stools when I initially went over. There was that adaptation period. You may also experience a little bit more hunger when you first switch over to this high-fat carnivore diet. Now, I was not keto adapted doing carnivore diet because I was eating a lot of protein, my blood glucose, and I have the data from my continuous glucose monitor. as well as just random checks on my Keto Mojo, my ketones never went above 0.5 unless I was doing an extended fast, and my blood glucose typically stayed 90s and even 100 when I was doing the carnivore diet. So to be keto adapted, your blood glucose should be in the high 70s, low 80s, and your ketones should measure 1.5 to 2.5. When I switched over to the high-fat carnivore diet, I was a little hungrier to begin with, actually a lot hungrier, because the portion sizes are much, much smaller than what I was used to when I was eating just a standard carnivore diet. So you do have to kind of get through that, and that's why I think some people initially gain weight. They're not used to eating those smaller portions, and the fat is just so delicious. It's extremely easy to overeat. So, and the other thing is, if you do gain a little weight, which I did, it's okay. You can always lose it. You know, it is something that may happen to you, especially if you have metabolic damage or if your hormones are not properly functioning. You may need to gain a little bit of weight to get those hormones properly functioning again. I will mention that I had lost my cycle, and this had been going on since before I was on the carnivore diet. It was just irregular. It was very heavy. It was a mess. And since I switched to the high-fat carnivore diet, my cycle came back within 2 weeks, first of all, after switching to this way of eating. It has been every 28 days for the last 6 months, and I have been ovulating. So my hormones have absolutely loved this way of eating. Absolutely loved it. So it may be something that you want to try, especially if you're still having, you know, high blood glucose, if you're feeling hungry all the time, if you're waking up a lot at night, you know, or if you're getting those lab tests back, like low thyroid, and that could also be too much fasting as well, which I've talked about a lot in other videos, but that's just something to take a look at as you go through this journey. So I'm also thinking about showing you guys like 3 days worth of meals. I already did a what I eat in a day video, but I'm thinking about doing a full video of just like 3 days of high fat carnivore, what I eat in those 3 days, showing snacks and everything. It's just a lot of work, and I typically don't have the kitchen to myself, which is why I'm filming out here besides the bad sound. So it's just a little bit more challenging to film, but if that's something you want to see, comment in the section below, comment section below 3 days, and I'll know, kind of get a good sample size on if you guys would like to see that or not, and then put that video together for you guys. So I do hope that this video was helpful for you. Please feel free to share this with anyone who you feel could be helped. Subscribe, and I will catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.